Hi, in this video episode we're going to talk about the essay by Jacques Ellul called The Technological Society. It's an important essay. He wrote it in the early 1960s, and it's one of the first times where we see this idea of sort of technology going out of control. The position that he's arguing for in this essay is a position called technological determinism. So unlike our previous theorist, Davis, who thinks that there are all these problems with technology that we should fix by adopting a different perspective, Ellul believes that technology at this point is beyond human beings' ability to control. That is, it's taken on a life of its own. It has become, in his words, autonomous, right? Sort of governed by its own set of internal laws. He uses a term that is one that you're probably not, well, you're probably familiar with it, but it doesn't have the meaning that you think. He uses this term throughout his essay called technique. And when we use that term, I think we usually mean something like, well, that your technique, the style, or something that you use to, let's say, serve a ball in tennis, or the technique that you'd have when, doing ballet. Here, though, technique means something different. And I think what he means by technique is, well, let's go with this. I think it's a pair of glasses that, when worn, turns everything that you see into a machine. He goes through and he talks about how human beings, we started as tool users, and then at some point in our development we moved from simple tools into the use of machines. And machines are really unique and interesting kinds of tools, right? Machines typically have multiple parts. Those parts somehow work in unison, and those they perform some sort of function, right? They fulfill a function of some sort. So say, think of a clock, right? A clock's a great example of one of these early machines. It has all these gears, these pulleys, levers, and ultimately we can use that as a way to keep track of time, right? An internal combustion engine, another great example, right? It's got all these moving parts, and what I can do with that internal combustion engine, that machine, is I can take a liquid, gasoline, and I can actually transform it into distance, right? I can get places, I can go places that I want to get to. So machines end up having this, again, multiple parts that work together and fulfill some sort of function. And then what we can do is we can judge the machine based on how efficient it is, right? Does it perform that function well? If the machine breaks as well, there's an interesting way of fixing it. That is, we go in and we find the part that broke, fix that, and lo and behold, everything's sort of good again, right? So the problem, says Ellul, is that when human beings first made machines, we were looking at them, and in looking at them, that caused us to wear this new pair of glasses that he's going to call technique. And it's as though when I looked at the first machine, and I sort of looked up and I looked around, lo and behold, everything I looked at has been turned into a machine. So I'm in a forest right now, and if I wear the glasses of technique, I no longer see trees. Instead, what I'd see is a source of lumber to build my home, or an organism that's able to take carbon dioxide and turn it into oxygen. Perhaps it's a source of fuel to heat my home, right? And then again, I can judge it on how efficient it is. We even do this with people, right? So many of the administrators who work at colleges and universities start to view the entire university as though it's a giant machine, almost like a factory assembly line where students sort of go through and take their different classes, and at the end they roll off, and lo and behold, they're an educated students if we got them through there sort of quickly and efficiently. What ends up happening with this, though, is problematic because we end up losing our humanity. He gives the example that technique is sort of like King Midas and the Midas touch. Right, as the story goes, King Midas wanted the ability to turn things to gold with his touch and touch alone. But upon getting it, he was very excited until he went to hug his daughter, at which point he turned her to gold, which of course I think made him very sad. Right. Again, the idea though is if everything we see gets turned into a machine, there are important parts of that get left off, right? Important parts of that we don't see. If you go to your doctor and your doctor looks at your body the way a clockmaker looks at a clock, and just tries to scan through it and see, well, what's the part that's broken, right? If that doctor just looks at you as a machine, there's something important that doctor's going to miss about you, and probably even miss about your health. Now, again, good old Ellul's central claim is that technique has become autonomous. It now has taken on a life of its own, and we are incapable of doing anything to interfere with this or to change it. He claims that there are 4 sociological forces that we use for change. And this is interesting, right? There are 4 sources of social change. He goes through each one of them, tries to argue, well, we could do this in this film, argue about ways they've been efficient in the past in causing social change, but then describe why they're going to be inefficient with technique. So the basic argument, again, is there's 4 sources of social change. We're going to list them really quickly here. None of them will be effective against technique. Therefore, technique is out of control. Cool. The first force is morality. A great example where morality has caused social change is, let's say, the end of slavery, right? A whole bunch of people thought that the idea of owning slaves was a bad idea. It was immoral, and even though there were economies in the southern United States and that were dependent upon this institution, we ended it because it was wrong, right? Another great example of morality causing a social change is women's suffrage, women getting the right to vote. Interestingly, when women got the right to vote, they didn't get to vote in that vote. A bunch of men are the ones who finally decided, let's give women the right to vote. Now, it was, that's not to take anything away from the women's movement at all, right? Those suffragists did an amazing job at convincing people of the morality of allowing women to vote. But it was really against men's interest to give women the right to vote, one could argue. But what is it that inspired them to do this? What is it that inspired them to vote this way? Well, it was immoral, right? There's no justification for denying women the right to vote. Well, how is this going to be ineffective with technique? Well, if we take a look at the past interaction between technology and our morality, I think that we can solidly say that technology seems to change our sense of morality. A few examples. A couple hundred years ago, the idea of taking an organ out of one person's body and putting it in another body would have been considered horribly immoral. Blood transfusions 200 years ago, unthinkable, right? But now that the technology's there, we can do it, we can keep people alive. It's almost switched, right? So it's now at the point where if you don't, right, agree to be an organ donor, people sort of look at you strangely. Another great example is the sort of invention of the birth control pill. Prior to the invention of birth control, we had a certain moral view. Our society had a certain moral view about women and their sexuality and what type of sexuality was considered okay. And a woman who had multiple sexual partners outside of marriage was considered immoral, right? This person is doing things she probably ought not do. But lo and behold, with the invention of the birth control pill and then even other forms of birth control, lo and behold, what we've seen is a steady increase in the types of sexual activities that women feel comfortable engaging in. So a new piece of technology seems to have changed our morality. So we can call this the argument from past interaction, right? In the past, when technology or technique and morality have interacted, lo and behold, technique is one. Why think the future is going to be any different than the past, right? It's going to probably continue. The second restraining force is public opinion, closely related to morality, at least according to Ellul. I could argue that they're substantially different, but he thinks that they're related. So maybe the public opinion would just shift. We decide that we had too much technology. We needed to sort of return to a way of living that was a little bit more simple or a little bit more honest. Maybe 12-year-old girls shouldn't have smartphones that give them unlimited access to the internet, or more importantly, other people access to that young woman. right? Which currently I think most cell phones do. So maybe we just decide through public opinion that we're going to sort of go back and just control or rein in technique. Okay, well, the problem is that, well, an example of where public opinion has shifted things in the past is the tuna industry, right? In the late 1880s, early 90s, when video cameras first came out, somebody happened to videotape tuna fishermen who were using nets to bring in the tuna. And as they brought in the nets, there were dolphins that had drowned, because of course dolphins are mammals. And there was some fairly gruesome scenes of fishermen with machete cutting the dolphin in half, throwing them back in the water, but it was a way to sort of catch the tuna. And a group of people that sort of grew up watching TV shows and movies that sort of celebrated dolphins were sort of horrified